I really enjoyed those two papers, and those are very substantial papers with a lot of details, a lot of information. I think 20 minutes doesn't quite do the justice that these papers deserve. There's a lot of rich information. And I would comment on each paper, but before I do that, I want to just highlight two things that I really see stand out from those two papers that are extremely positive. One is that both papers are very relevant. Okay? And I want to highlight that because oftentimes as academic, you are drawn to doing basic research, so to speak. And basic research, and this is something that high school students probably don't think about very much, but if you're going to academia, you'll be hearing things from professors that when you ask foundations for funding, a lot of times they rate your proposals, for example, based on the merit, and the merit oftentimes rated according to basic research, criteria for basic research, meaning that it's not necessary requirement that it has to be relevant immediately. But what I see in these two papers is that they have the academic scholarly merit, no question about it, and also they are extremely relevant, and not only relevant in the future, but relevant now. Okay, so I really want to highlight that. And the second is the future. It's about, both papers about China's future, and we all know the important role China is playing today, and not only today, but into the next several decades, or maybe longer. And just to add to that, both papers have also to do with people, children, in particular in Scott's case, but also people who are contributing to the labor market, contributing to productivity in a big way. Okay, so I see those two things as very encouraging. I will start with Scott's paper, first of all. And for those of you who don't know Scott, and probably there are only very few of you who don't know Scott, he's actually very famous in China. I saw his name, his face, his picture in Chinese newspapers. And last summer, I took 15 students from UCLA to Beijing for a 4-week visit, a travel study. And we went to a school called Dandelion School in the southern outskirts of Beijing, one of those migrant children's schools, one of several hundred migrant children's schools in China. And I saw some of students of Scott. And so those students were volunteering there and hosting a summer camp for migrant children. And they talk about Scott and his work there as well. And what I think Scott didn't have time to talk about very much today is the intervention dimension of his research. And I think you did talk about the vitamin pills that you provided to the parents. And so he's able to integrate research with community service. And community service is 7,000 miles away. Okay, I think that's pretty amazing. I have several questions for Scott. One has to do with the way that he deals with wage, or the way that he thinks about why wages in China would increase in the future. I believe, if I'm reading the paper correctly, is that he is connecting wage with families, or the willingness, or the willingness or not of rural labor to be going into the city. That's one of the factors anyway, because I remember seeing the demographics, of the women and men in rural areas, and to what extent are, for example, the middle-aged women willing to go to the cities to work. Anecdotally and maybe more generally, what we are hearing in China, however, is that the pioneer migrants, so to speak, those who left the countryside in the 80s and 90s, a lot of them were men, and the women were left back home. But more and more, we're seeing both the husband and wife going out, leaving behind children. in the countryside. So I call that couple migration versus the sole or singular migration in the past. So that seems to be the trend now. And so I would actually offer an alternative way of thinking about it, and that is not necessarily demographics perhaps, but is really the labor movement, which we've heard about last year, and especially Foxconn and Honda, the waves of sort of protests that led to management yielding to pressure from the workers, and therefore some of those plants have been increasing their wages, and some of those have been moving away from Guangdong, for example, to interior areas. So, and of course, hukou is a major factor. The fact that many rural workers are entering into a segmented labor market. In other words, it's not a complete labor market. So wages, therefore, are artificially depressed for the rural workers. So that's the first point. The second point has to do with, in the paper, Scott has a lot of information about to what extent students in boarding schools perform better or not as good as those in non-boarding schools. And the students in boarding schools, because they are eating at the school, there is a lot of constraint on what kind of diet they have, right? So my reading of that is that boarding versus non-boarding schools in Scott's paper are being used as proxies for the diet. And diet, it's one of the reasons for the discrepancy in performance, academic performance between those two sets of students. I wanted to offer, or maybe suggest also, that there are other factors that play a role, and that gets back again into the family, the parents. Okay? Whether the parents are present or absent, whether that plays a role. In fact, I think last year or the year before, Scott presented a paper in one of the conferences, the geographers' conferences, and I remember in that paper, he showed actually that the absence of a father, a migrant worker, doesn't lead to a decline in academic performance of students. Actually, it contributes to an increase in academic performance, which is kind of counterintuitive, but I know Scott has an answer for that. So lastly, the high school tuition that Scott has shown. Why is it that the high school tuition in public schools in China so much higher than everywhere else? Well, I would say that those are actually not public high schools, or not public in the way that we think about it in America. And so I think it would be interesting to think about what is actually public and what is actually private. And the private schools in China actually, unlike private schools here, the private schools in China actually mostly being run at a lower standard, okay, than the public schools in China. Okay. So let me turn to Haizhen Li's paper. I only have a couple of minutes. Okay. Again, I really enjoyed this paper very much. It's methodologically very rigorous. And what I like about the paper, there are many things, but I like to highlight a few things, is that it addresses both the aggregate, meaning the total human capital in China, as well as the per capita. Okay. And also it decomposes the contributions, decomposes human capital into the several contributions. And I think it shows very clearly the importance of education, the importance of urbanization. Those are the two things that he highlighted. Which kind of was also kind of intriguing, because I think he showed very well that human capital is increasing, both in terms of not so much because of population growth. In other words, it's not the quantity of the population that is doing the trick here. It's the productivity. Okay. So in a sense, if you're comparing Scott and Haizhen's paper sounds somewhat more optimistic. He's focusing more on the sort of the increased quality of the labor force. And I like the fact that he highlighted very much the widening gap between the rural and the urban, which is certainly very true. I guess he's not here, so I suppose I could still ask a question, although he couldn't really quite answer it. At some point in the paper, and he might have actually mentioned it in the presentation, in the videotape presentation, is that the role of retirement, or the role of retirement age. Okay. The official retirement age in China is 55 for women and 60 for men. Okay. I'm very happy that we don't have that in this country, because otherwise some of you probably should have been retired. Some, not all. But that's the official retirement age. Okay? As China's economy increasingly privatizes, I wonder what that actually means, and I wonder what that actually, what kind of role that will be in the modeling kind of framework as more and more, people are working in private enterprises where retirement age doesn't mean as much as before. I would close by saying one thing. Given the fact that this is a conference organized by US-China Institute, we should say something about the US. Okay? So what I take away from the two papers is this, that China's growing, we're looking at China's future, China's human capital is increasing, quality is getting better, policies that help to educate the rural children, if they're effective, will contribute to this trend. What does it mean for the United States? I think all of these things are really good for the United States. Okay. I say that because in China, if you go to China, okay, more and more people don't really think about China as the world's factory anymore. Okay. It is still the world's factory, but at the same time, there are so many other things going on. Okay. In a Beijing development area, in the southern part of Beijing, for example, there are biopharmaceutical labs. Okay. There are a lot of high-tech kind of activities, and the labor force is increasingly being upgraded. Okay. So I said that because I think the rhetoric about China being the world's factory, the rhetoric about China taking away sort of low labor-intensive jobs from the United States, it is still somewhat true, but it is important, I think, for us here to think about how the labor force here can improve in its competitiveness rather than thinking about jobs being taken away. In other words, if the labor force here is competitive enough, then jobs will come. So it may be that when one sees that the labor force in China is improving its quality, that will help us to think about what sort of a rhetoric or what sort of conversations should take place on this side of the Pacific. Thank you.